But we have been traveling the road of formation this year, working on becoming more of who Jesus wants to be. Formation is a slow, faithful work God does in us as truth is lived out under pressure over time. It's not about quick fixes. It's not about rushing things, emotional highs, or constant activity. It's about becoming steady, faithful people who are shaped and formed by Christ in real everyday life. And as I said, we've been traveling down this road this year, and this year it's not primarily about doing more. It's about becoming more deeply formed in Christ. And sometimes to do that, we back off from activity a bit and just settle and learn to be present with the Lord. As we set out, we learned about problems and tension. There are problems we solve and tensions we manage. There are things in life that just aren't going to go away. There are always going to be a tension, so we learn to manage them. There are things in life that are problems that we do learn to solve, but others that we just have to learn to manage. And we learn to be comfortable in that tension because they're always going to be present in our lives. And we talked about several of those as we started the year off together. And we find peace in the Lord. We get comfortable in that tension. And then we continued with ordered love, talking about the correct order of our love. Sometimes, though we may be well-meaning, we've been taught or picked up the idea somewhere along the way that loving comfort and pleasure is wrong, which it's not. We just have to put things in their proper order. The reality is that our good given desires, when we exercise those desires within God's intended context, they're good. And a desire for comfort is good. It just needs to be in the correct order. And when we get outside of the boundaries that God has given us, that's when they become a problem. And we looked at the order in which we should love things. God is highest, then his will, then people, then purpose and calling, and then below that is comfort and pleasure. And we can and should love all of those things. We just make sure that we love God most and then keep things in order after that. And one thing that can jumble up that order very quickly is what we've been talking about, suffering. When we suffer, that can really throw things out of whack for us, I guess you could say, because it very quickly destroys our pleasure and comfort. I think that's part of why at times we lift suffering up and pay more attention to it than we really should. Suffering can shrink our world to the point that all we see is the suffering. We talked about that last week. That's when it's imperative to remember the order of our love and keep the Lord at the top of that. And everyone suffers. It's not something we're going to avoid. It's not even something we can shortcut. It's something that we have to live through. It's a tension that we manage as we go through life. It's not a problem to solve. And that requires a proper perspective and a proper order of our love. And so we've been looking at, over these past several weeks, finding peace and suffering well. And it's important in understanding that we're not creating peace, we're not building peace, we're finding it. And in our quest for peace, we've dismantled a few things along the way, some false assumptions, deconstructed the illusion of control that we like to think we have. We often think we have a lot more control over life than we really do. And we talked about the violence of bad theology and how even sometimes when we're well-meaning, we can hurt other people with our words and our misunderstanding of God. And we learned about lament as well, the process of bringing our pain into the presence of God, being honest with God, asking bold questions, and then trusting the Lord with those things. And last week we reached a crossroads where we exposed the fragility of relying on explanation and circumstances as a means of finding peace and how that just doesn't work. And when we stand at that crossroads, down one road, there lies deeper faith, deeper trust, And down the other road, there lies bitterness and resentment. And as we continue down the path of formation, we come to another one of many necessary stops today: humility before mystery. In many ways, it brings together everything else we've spoken about along the way so far. And at the same time, it's an easy stop to miss. It's one we can just drive right by and not even see it. And I think sometimes we do that. Even long-time believers sometimes go by this and miss it. But it's imperative that we stop here, that we talk about this, if we are going to find peace. Because we often think we occupy a higher position than we really do. We often think we have more understanding than we actually do. One of the strangest, I think, human traits is our ability to become fully convinced that we understand things we are not in a position to understand. We assume knowledge we don't have. We think we know what someone else might be going through, or we think we know what they're thinking, or like Job's friends, they thought they knew why Job was suffering. And that's a human trait. We all do that often. And we assume to understand motives, reasons, intentions behind actions. We assume to understand why people do what they do. Sometimes we assume to understand why God does things. We assume that we know what he's doing. We assume we know why he's doing it. And that's something we all do. We all make assumptions and treat it as if it's a solid truth. And occasionally we may be right, but often we'll find that we're wrong, like Job's friends. And it's not always rebellious to do that. It's sometimes we do it sincerely without even realizing that we're making assumptions about something, or that we don't understand what's actually happening. And we've seen in the book of Job that God himself said Job was upright, that he was blameless. And Job suffered severely. And he has been lamenting, he's been grieving as we've looked at Job, talked about Job. He's defended himself from some accusations from his friends. And after all of that happens, and Job's been lamenting, he's lost everything, his family, his wealth, his health. He's defended himself against the false accusations of his friends. He's lamented, going through grief. God finally speaks. And when he does, God doesn't give Job answers. He doesn't give him an explanation as to why what is happening is happening. We have a better view of the situation than Job does. We know what's going on more than him. And after all that, when God finally speaks to Job, what he says to Job, he says not to feed his own ego. That's obvious. And he doesn't intend to crush or humiliate Job. We talked last week about how when we read, we really can't hear the tone of what he says, but we know about the character of God, and he wasn't trying to crush or humiliate Job. God said exactly what Job needed to hear, the way he needed to hear it, exactly when he needed to hear it, in light of what he was going through. And when God speaks to Job, he doesn't make statements, doesn't give him answers, explanations. What he does is he asks him a series of questions, quite a few actually. God asked Job, where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Can you command the morning? Do you provide food for the raven? He asks him all these questions. And God isn't asking because he needs answers. He's not asking Job even because he thinks Job will be able to answer. He uses questions to show Job that he is trying to evaluate reality from a perspective he doesn't actually hold, that he's assuming knowledge that he doesn't actually have. He doesn't actually possess the knowledge to understand what's going on around him. And this is obviously a humbling experience for Job, as it would be for any of us. God interrogates us with a bunch of questions. And listen to how Job responds. In Job chapter 40, verses 3 through 5, It says, Then Job answered the Lord and said, Behold, I am vile. What shall I answer you? I will lay my hand over my mouth. Once I have spoken, but I will not answer, yes, twice, but I will proceed no further. Job, in what he says he covers his mouth. He's not going to talk anymore. Job is not humiliated into silence. He's humbled into perspective. He's not humiliated into silence. He's humbled into perspective. God gives him perspective. And in this, Job uses the word vile to describe himself. And through modern ears, that might sound like disgusting or worthless or something like that. But the word vile carries the idea of something small or brought low. It's a word that communicates perspective, which Job now has after God speaks to him. And Job he's admitting that he's overestimated his perspective. And he has been speaking to realities that are actually beyond his vantage point. He's assumed things that he doesn't really understand, which we all do at times. And that's not necessarily wrong to do that. We just need to be careful when we do that. We need to be careful that we're not assuming knowledge we don't have or a position that we don't actually hold. And partway through questioning Job, God says, answer me if you can. And he knows Job can't answer his questions, but he says, answer me if you can, to bring that to light to Job, I suppose. And God is showing Job through this series of questions that he is human like us. He's finite, he's limited, and that he has assumed a vantage point of reality that he doesn't actually have. He's assumed that he knows more than he really does. Job, in this conversation with God, he calls himself vile, but it's a word of perspective. He hasn't lost intelligence. He hasn't lost value through this, but he has lost the illusion that he occupies a position of greater understanding than he really does. And God makes that clear to him when he asks him these questions. And that's a constant tension for us between our vantage point and God's vantage point. We often assume that we know more or that we can see more than what's really true without even realizing it. And that's hard for us to understand because it's just almost natural for us to do it. It's hard to explain. Maybe it's hard to even accept the idea that I assume things that I don't really know, but I treat them like I do. And that's partly why Job says to God, I've heard with my ears, but now I see. I've heard with my ears, but now I see. Job had been evaluating God, what he's doing from a position no human actually occupies. Assuming knowledge he doesn't have, he's looking into the mysteries of God and assuming things about that. It's not rebellion so much as it is humanity. It's just kind of what we do. We all do that. We assume a position of understanding that we don't actually occupy. We assume we know what's going on in someone else's life, why something might be happening. We assume things about God that we don't really have the vantage point to understand. And we do that without even realizing or thinking about it quite a bit. As Job grieves, he laments, and he suddenly begins trying to solve the equation of his suffering, of what's happening in his life. He says things like, I have sought to walk uprightly. He's thinking about, okay, why is this happening? I've sought to uprightly. He says, my life is being crushed. And at first that sounds pretty reasonable, but gradually he moves along from lamenting to kind of cross-examining how God governs reality as to why is this going on, how God does things. And in doing so, likely without even realizing it, he begins to assume that he has enough information to actually do that, to analyze how that should be done, how things should go. And we've all heard people do that. We even sometimes do that ourselves. We assume things that we don't really know, but we act on those things as if we're very certain about them. We sometimes assume a knowledge and perspective that humans just don't have. We just don't possess. Suffering often clarifies the limits of our understanding for us. And it brings up questions that we can't answer, shows us things that we can't understand, like it does for Job. And when that happens, we find ourselves in a position where we must choose between trusting God or continue in the illusion of control. When we come to that place where we're asking questions, we either trust God or we continue in the illusion of control. And trust is the road that leads to accepting the limits of our knowledge of human understanding. It leads to deeper faith. It leads to deeper trust. It leads to spiritual growth. Down the other road, the road to bitterness and resentment, that involves hanging on to the illusion of control. It involves hanging on to the idea that of the things that we assume that we know about God and what he's doing in our situation, assuming we have answers to questions that we can't answer. And for most of us here, it's very likely we would say we trust God. If you're here this morning, there's a pretty good chance most of us would say that. Maybe not everyone, but most of us would. We'd say we trust God. And when we say we trust God, we mostly do that from a comfortable place. Of course, we do it from where we're comfortable. When things are going well, we say, yes, I trust God. We're comfortable trusting God when we're comfortable. But the problem with comfort is it doesn't challenge trust. It doesn't challenge trust. It's easy to say that, but when things get uncomfortable, it challenges whether or not that's true when we say we trust God. And when we suffer, that makes that apparent. Suffering often shows us that God governs reality from a position we don't understand, that we can't see. Of course, there's things we can know about God, but there's great many mysteries about him that we don't understand, that we don't know. A foundational part of spiritual growth, of faith, of trust, and peace is humbling ourselves and accepting that. Accepting that we don't know everything about God. We don't understand all the mysteries about God. There are things that we can't understand. But I think we often feel pressured to be able to answer every question. And the reality is we just are not able to do that. You know, the suffering question is one that comes up often. Why do we suffer? That's a difficult question to answer. And there are things that God does that are beyond our field of vision. And we need to be careful about making assumptions that we know what he's doing, because a foundational part of faith, trust, and growth is humbling ourselves and accepting that there's things about God that we don't know. And it's in the mystery of God that we find peace. Humility begins when we accept our position before God. When we see who he is, we see who we are. We understand that our knowledge, what we can see, our vantage point is limited in comparison to his. And humility is having a modest view, simply having a modest view of who we are in relation to who God is. Humility replaces those assumptions we like to make with trusting God. Replaces assumptions with trust. Mystery reveals the limits of human perspective, the mysteries of God, things we don't understand about him. They reveal the limits of our perspective. Now, up until this point, Job has wrestled with trying to press his suffering, and we probably all do this, press his suffering into a mold that he can comprehend, shrink it down into something he can understand. Bring things beyond our perspective inside of human logic so we can make sense of them. That's what we want to do. We seek those things. And when God finally speaks to Job, he reveals something Job knew, but he didn't see. He knew it, but he didn't see it. There's things we know, but we haven't seen. Job knew that God operated from a level beyond his own understanding. He knew that. We know that. We understand that. He operates beyond the limits of human wisdom. Remember, Job's friends evaluated Job's situation from their own lens of tradition, from experience, from certainty. And they assumed they knew why Job was suffering. They thought they knew why he was suffering. They speak to that. They talk about it. But we see that their understanding was limited. They didn't really know. They assumed they did, but they didn't really know. And like his friends, like us, Job's perspective is limited by his own knowledge and experience. And we often assume knowledge beyond what we actually know. Now, our experience, our knowledge, they're real and they're valid, but they're kind of like what God says about the waves of the sea. You can only come this far. Our wisdom, our experience, our knowledge only goes so far. And we can't always apply our knowledge, our experience in a way that says, this is how God always does things. That doesn't work out very well. Didn't work out well for Job's friends. But God leads Job into a position of clarity, of perspective, where he sees that God has understanding beyond his own. He doesn't understand what God understands, but he sees that God has understanding beyond his own. Not just hearing that, but seeing that is a turning point in spiritual growth. Seeing, not just hearing, but seeing that God's understanding is beyond our own. And that is tested when God's actions don't align with our own experience, our own expectations, and our own limitations. It's tested when we suffer and we don't know why. It's tested when we suffer and we lose control. There's nothing about it that we control. Something just happens and there's nothing we can do about it. And in suffering, this is counterintuitive. It's counterintuitive, but it's in the things we don't understand, the mysteries of God, understanding we don't understand everything he does, his character, the mystery of God, that's where we find peace. That's where we find peace. Maybe we've heard that. Maybe we say we believe that. But like Job, we have yet to see it. It's often when we experience chaos, when we experience pain, when we suffer, go through difficulty, things that are beyond our control and our explanation, that's when we humble ourselves, and that's when we see it. That's when we see that God's understanding is beyond our own, and that's the place where we trust God. We see God in awe and mystery, and we trust him, knowing that we don't know, but he does. That's where we find peace. In Job 42, the first 3 verses, this is what it says. It said, "Then Job answered the Lord and said, I know that you can do everything, and no thought can be withheld from you. Who is he who hides counsel without knowledge? Therefore, I have uttered what I did not understand, and things too wonderful for me, which I did not know." And that last line's important. I've uttered what I did not understand. That's exactly what we're talking about. Speaking to things we don't really understand, but making our assumptions certain. I've uttered what I did not understand. And this is where Job sees that he was speaking from a place of limited understanding, speaking to things that he thought he understood, but he really didn't. And doing that's not always wicked. It's not always evil. Sometimes it's just limited. And we didn't even realize the assumptions we were making. We've already established that lamenting involves honesty with God and involves asking God bold questions. There's nothing wrong with asking bold questions. What we're talking about is not about avoiding knowledge, not seeking knowledge or understanding. It's about humbling ourselves and trusting God within the limits of our understanding, because there's a boundary on it. There's a boundary on our experience and knowledge, and the mysteries of God are outside of that. Our faith deepens through honest questions, asking honest questions, seeking answers. We just need to remember to humble ourselves in our conclusions and be very careful that we're not making assumptions. And there's a difference between asking questions and making assumptions, or being sure that we know why what's happening is happening, why God does the things the way he does them, assuming knowledge we don't possess. And one of the greatest human struggles is the desire to control our circumstances. We want to control our life. We want to control everything that goes on around it. We want to control our environment, and we want to be able to explain everything. And that's not a bad thing. That desire comes from a good God-given desire. It even goes hand in hand with one of the first commands that God gave people. He said, be fruitful and multiply, fill and subdue the earth, exercise dominion over every living thing. Go out into the earth, populate it, cultivate it, protect it, oversee it, develop it, take control of your environment. God even put Adam in the garden to tend it, to keep it under control. And that's a good God-given desire. Don't want to take charge of things, control them, if that's the right word. Good God-given desire and a command. And part of exercising that desire is creating an environment of peace, of stability, of predictability, of clarity, all of those things. And that's good. It's good to do that. We should do that. It's a command from God. It's a desire he's given us. As humans, we've been given authority to take charge of and organize our environment, steward the world for God. We build, we organize, we discover, we explore, we do all of these things. We educate, we learn, we protect, we develop. But we've not been given authority. We've been given authority to do all those things, but we've not been given authority to determine ultimate outcomes. We've not been given authority to control suffering. We've not been given authority to control other people's hearts. We've not been given authority to control tomorrow or death or the mysteries of God. There's a boundary around our authority, around our stewardship. Job was upright. He was blameless. He was a good man. He raised a great family, obviously. He built a good life. He was wealthy, had an incredible family. He exercised his God-given desire to shape the world around him. The desire to work, to produce good outcomes, to do all those things through good stewardship. But now, in his suffering, Job has come to the boundary between human stewardship and the mysteries of God. There's a boundary there. And just like any of us, he's looking for explanations. He's looking for answers in his suffering. And that is a crossroads when we come to that place, because sooner or later we come to the boundary of our own stewardship, authority, knowledge, wisdom, experience. And then beyond that are the mysteries of God. And we all come to that place. It's a crossroads. One road leads to deeper faith and trust, and the other to resentment and bitterness. And when we stand at that intersection, the road that we take is determined by the question we ask. There's a couple we can ask. We can ask, how can I respond to this faithfully? How do I respond to this situation, suffering, pain? How do I respond to this faithfully? How do I respond faithfully to what I don't understand? That's the road to deeper faith, to deeper trust. Or we can ask, how can I gain mastery over this? How can I control it? How can I take charge of what is happening and control it, even though I don't have the answers of how to do that? And I'm not going to have them because they're on the other side of that boundary. We distort our stewardship and our understanding when we move from cultivating our corner of creation to attempting to manage the realities that only God can manage. When we take on responsibilities that aren't ours to take on, the things that only God governs are often a mystery to us. Like all the questions he asked Job, that's what he's showing Job. The things that God governs are mysteries to people. We don't understand them, we can't control them. And now Job sees that with clarity. He's like, okay, now I see the difference. There are things within the mysteries of God that I have no knowledge of, that I can't control. And Job sees that with clarity. The Bible speaks of sin and transgression. Sin and transgression. Sin is missing the mark, kind of like if you were an archer and you're shooting at a target, you miss the bullseye, you fall short of the standard God has set. That's what sin is. Transgression is crossing over a boundary God has set. And suffering often reveals that we have taken our good God-given desire to exercise authority over our environment, over the boundary to where the mysteries of God take over, to where God is responsible, not us. And think about the questions that God asked Job in the series of questions he asked him. They're all questions about creation, which I think is really interesting. He says, can you command the dawn? Can you store snow? Can you sustain the world? God created us to bring order and understanding to the world in which we live. We build houses, solve problems, cultivate, grow food, do all these things. Cultivate land, create systems, education. We learn, we grow. God has given us the command and the desire to do that, and that's a good thing. But suffering often clarifies the boundaries of that desire to take charge of our circumstances, our environment around us. But we're created to steward, not exercise ultimate control. We don't have the knowledge, the wisdom, or hold the position to do that, but sometimes we act as though we do, and we assume that we do. And much of our fear, much of our anxiety, much of our discontentment with life comes from trying to overstep the boundaries of our stewardship into the mysteries of God and into things that only He's responsible for. And there's a lot of struggle that comes from that. When we attempt to take responsibility for things that only God has responsibility for. Sometimes we attempt to take responsibility for other people in ways that we really can't. We want to control what they're doing, but that never goes well. We attempt to take on responsibilities that belong to God, and that never goes well either. And suffering often exposes where stewardship has quietly transgressed over into control. Part of finding peace is seeing those boundaries clearly and recognizing that over there, these things, I'm not responsible for them. I don't understand them. Those are the mysteries of God. And like I said, sometimes we feel like we have to answer so many questions and be able to answer every question that we forget that there's questions we can't answer and we'll never be able to answer. And that's okay. It's okay. So part of finding peace is seeing those boundaries clearly. And how do we do that? In Romans 11:33, Paul says, "Oh, the depth of the riches and wisdom and knowledge of God. How unsearchable are his judgments and unfathomable are his ways." If you read about Paul, you know he went through a lot. He was stoned, beaten, whipped, shipwrecked, left for dead. He was cold. He was hungry. All kinds of things happened to Paul as he traveled the known world and preached the gospel, went on his missionary journeys. And through all of that difficulty, suffering, hardship, he chose the road of deeper faith and trust. Paul's not angry that God is beyond him at all. He's in awe of the fact that God is beyond him. He has awe for God, and he finds peace in that. He finds joy in that. And we find peace when our awe for God replaces our desire for control, our desire to manipulate everything around us is replaced by awe for the Lord, his magnificence, the mystery of God, the things we don't understand. Maturing spiritually is discovering that peace comes from knowing God, understanding his character, and understanding that there are a lot of things about him we don't know. The mysteries of God. Being in awe of things we don't understand. And that's so counterintuitive. Paul writes, how unsearchable are his judgments. How unfathomable are his ways. There's so many things about God I don't understand, and I am in awe of him. That's where he finds peace and joy. And Paul recognizes that God's wisdom, it's not just bigger than ours, it's categorically different than ours. It's categorically beyond what we know, what we can understand. And trying to understand the mysteries of God is kind of like trying to pour the ocean into a coffee cup. It's just not going to happen. It's impossible. It's counterintuitive because we want to control everything around us. I know I do. I want to control the temperature in my office. I want to control how loud the music is. And those aren't bad things until we overstep the boundary into things that only God is responsible for. The world tells us all the time, master your reality, curate your life, engineer certainty, hustle, make things happen. And a lot of that stuff is fine. There's really nothing wrong with it until it crosses over the boundary of stewardship under God into responsibility for what only God is responsible for. And the world tells us, take control of your life. God says steward your life. They're two different things. Steward under the Lord, in awe of him, seeing the mysteries of God. And it's not like he's threatened by human efforts to take control. He's not threatened by that, obviously. He could let us struggle in our discontent and our anxiety and being angry at this, that, and the other, and whatever's happening around us and constantly worried. He could just leave us to struggle in that perpetually. But I think suffering is often a tool that God uses to show us, hey, you're stepping into the boundary of things you don't understand, the boundary of things that you shouldn't do, the boundary of places you shouldn't go. We're overstepping boundaries into his responsibility. And I think that's what causes us a lot of discontent, stress, anxiety, all of those things when we try to get over that boundary where only God is responsible. When we see that boundary and trust God beyond it, saying, I trust God with that, that's his, I don't have control of that, I don't even really understand it. It's the mysteries of God that grow us in our awe of him and his magnificence. And those are the things that direct us to trust him. In the things of God that pass our understanding is where we find peace in him, knowing that he's beyond it. He's bigger. He's more powerful than that, than my circumstances. I can't control them, but I can trust him in them. What the New Testament calls peace that passes understanding. It's peace beyond our understanding. God uses what we can't understand to help us see that he does. Do you ever go through a situation like that? You're suffering, and it brings so much clarity. I see that at funerals all the time. I've probably done 50 or 60 funerals, and everything changes at a funeral. All the walls, all of the assumptions are down. One of the best places to preach the gospel there is at a funeral, because people are snapped back into reality in what they can actually control and not control. We may not understand the mystery and greatness of God, or we may think we understand it, but if we don't see it in difficult circumstances, we'll see nothing but the difficulty. We sometimes forget that God can accomplish great things in what humans think is an absolute disaster. Where all we see is chaos and suffering, we forget that God can be doing great things in that. The cross shows us that. It shows us, the cross gives us like a glimpse into the mysteries of God. What looked like chaos, injustice, confusion, even victory for evil, from a human perspective, is where God accomplished redemption. And of course, you know, we're looking back on it hindsight. Hindsight's always 20/20. You know, just like we're looking at Job, and we know more about what was going on with Job than Job did when we read about it. We can look back at the cross now and understand that Christ died for us, that he suffered, he shed his blood, he died to pay the price for our sin, to purchase our redemption. And when we look at him in faith, look to him in faith, we're reconciled to God. But had we been there on that day, had we been following him like the disciples, we wouldn't understand what we do now. It would have been a totally different scenario for us. The disciples didn't understand what was happening. When Jesus was arrested, they forsook him and fled, the Bible tells us. They all ran away. They went and they hid in fear. There was sorrow, there was confusion, there was disbelief. There was like, what just happened? From their perspective, maybe they just watched Jesus suffer and die, their friend, their teacher. And it was a horrible death. It wasn't like it was just an accident or something. He was put on trial for being innocent and nailed to a cross. Their hope was gone. I'm sure they felt like, gosh, all of this time we've been following him, we've just wasted all that time. They thought he was going to come and set up his kingdom. Simon Peter even says, well, I guess I'm going to go fishing. He goes back to what he was doing before, falls back into his old routine. And when they heard Jesus was alive, they didn't believe it. But before all of that happened, back in Matthew chapter 16, verse 21, the Bible tells us that Jesus specifically told his disciples, he says, I'm going to Jerusalem. He's going to suffer and die. He tells them this, and that he would be resurrected on the third day. He told them exactly what was going to happen. And the same verse says Jesus began to do that from that day forth. So he told them multiple times what was going to happen. And Simon Peter, his reaction to that was, far be it from you, Lord. That's not going to happen. We can't do that. You see, Peter had his own plan in his own mind. He says, that's never going to happen to you. He had his own plan, like we often do. He didn't understand the mystery of God and what was going on there. And the disciples thought Jesus was going to go to Jerusalem and set himself up as king, cast off the Roman Empire, redeem the nation of Israel. That's probably why they thought he was going to Jerusalem. But Jesus told them multiple times. They heard what was going to happen. They heard what he said. But maybe they didn't hear because they'd already made assumptions about what he was doing, why he was going there. They didn't see it because they had their own assumptions about it. When we look at Old Testament prophecy, when we look at the story of Jesus with his disciples, there's often a time of hearing what God says, and then there's a time of waiting, and then there's a time of confusion, and then there's a time of seeing, when they actually see, oh, that's what he meant. And assumptions been made between hearing and seeing, assuming things that we don't really know. are dangerous. Sometimes we hear, but we don't see because we've already decided what we know. We've made assumptions and then we act on them with certainty. And we've already decided what faithfulness looks like, what being blessed looks like, what victory looks like, what rescue looks like, what it's supposed to look like in our mind. We make assumptions about it. And often when we suffer, we've already decided what peace is supposed to look like. And we usually associate it with our circumstances. Okay, my circumstances change, I'll have peace. Instead of looking at God in awe and finding peace in Him. Instead of seeing the mysteries of God, the things we don't actually understand, and finding peace in Him. The disciples heard what Jesus said multiple times. He told them what was going to happen. But they didn't see until they saw Him resurrected. When they heard He was resurrected, they didn't even believe it. They didn't see. They heard, they thought they understood, but they didn't see until they saw Jesus' resurrection. And they saw Him. And when that happened, their perspective was changed. Just like Job, often when we suffer, our perspective is changed. And the disciples, when they saw Jesus resurrected, when they were able to see what He was talking about, even though they'd heard, they thought they understood, they'd made assumptions, they were wrong. But when they saw Jesus resurrected, they went from hiding to boldly preaching that Jesus is resurrected, that He was risen. And you and I are here today because of that. If you could trace somebody shared the gospel with you, if you could trace that back all the way, it'd go back to when the disciples saw Jesus. Mystery is rightly framed in the cross. We get a little bit of a glimpse into the mystery of God in the cross. The cross is the clearest declaration that God can be fully good, fully wise, and still permit immense suffering for purpose beyond the immediate understanding of the people in the situation. The cross is where God took control of sin and death because we can't. And we can hear about that, but until we see it, we're lost. We can hear it, we can think about it, we can think we understand, make assumptions about it, think we have to work and do all these things. But what Jesus did on the cross for us is complete. Of course, we live in obedience to Him, but we trust Him. We don't work our way to heaven. We trust the work that Jesus completed on the cross for us. We put our faith in Him. Job places his hand over his mouth when God asked him these questions, not because God crushed him or shamed him or rejected him, but because God gave him perspective, and it humbled him, and he's in awe of God, and he understands there are mysteries about God that he just does not understand. Peace is found when we stop trying to take control of a place where only God and only the mysteries of God stand, where things are His responsibility alone. That's where peace is found. That's where peace is found. So how are we going to apply this week? Grow. Ask yourself honestly, where have I assumed I fully understand what God should be doing? Or I fully understand what He's doing? Where have I made assumptions? Am I making some demands for explanations before I actually trust Him? Am I trying to control something I can't? Formation deepens when we ask honest questions. Sometimes we need to ask ourselves some questions. We ask honest questions while remaining humble about our conclusions. Practice surrender. Surrender where you want to control, but you know you really can't. Okay, you're not responsible for carrying omniscience or omnipotence. We're not all powerful. We're not all knowing. We're not responsible for those things, for carrying those things. Those are the mysteries of God. We're not required to fully understand every circumstance, everything that happens before we walk faithfully through it, trusting the Lord. We don't have to understand everything before we trust. Sometimes peace comes not from getting answers, but from finally accepting our position before God, saying, okay, well, I can't understand everything. I'm just going to have to trust the Lord. And that's where we find peace. Like Job, there comes a moment where growing faith that's being formed says, I've spoken things too wonderful for me. I've assumed knowledge that I don't have. That's not despair, it's perspective. And go. Carry humility into a world obsessed with certainty. It's okay to not have an answer for every question. There are things we can know, of course, but sometimes we need to get comfortable in the tension of not knowing. I think people are exhausted from pretending they fully understand everything, that we have an answer for everything. There's suffering, there's justice, there's motives, there's all these things that go on in the world, politics, God, life. Be someone steady enough to admit mystery and hold on to faith and trust God in that. It's okay to admit some things are beyond us. That doesn't mean at all giving up intelligence or reason or seeking knowledge, understanding. It doesn't mean any of those things. But it's in the mystery, it's in the difficulty, it's in the mystery of God that we gain perspective. That's where we find peace. And not every hurting person needs a simplistic answer. We probably can't give them one anyway. Sometimes they need someone who is calm enough to trust God in the middle of unanswered questions. Would you stand with me as we pray? Let's go to the Lord in prayer. Father in heaven, we come to you in prayer. We're grateful for the day. I pray that we would humble ourselves before you, knowing that we can know many things about you. We can learn about your character, your greatness. But there are things that are beyond the boundaries of our wisdom and our understanding, that are mysteries to us, and that we can trust you in these things, the things we can't control, things that aren't our responsibility. And I pray that we do that we would look to you in awe and wonder and your greatness and find peace, that we would trust you completely and understand that we don't know everything. We can't know everything. But we can trust you in everything. It's in the name of Jesus we pray. Amen.